Oh boy, this Nintendo Switch 2, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time remake, could be even bigger than we thought. Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about the rumored and long theorized Ocarina of Time remake. Even more, a few days ago, there was a rumor from popular leaker Nash Weedle, who's been getting a lot of things right about Switch 2 lately, such as mouse controls in Metroid Prime 4, the tarnished edition of Elden Ring, Assassin's Creed Shadows coming to Nintendo Switch 2, Donkey Kong Bonanza instead of 3D Mario being in the Direct, and more. He's been getting a lot right lately, and he was in a podcast with a friend of the channel, Attack the Backlog, where he gave us an update on Ocarina of Time Remake, or something we had not heard about, and I've been thinking about what he said about this game, and there's something here that I think has perhaps even bigger implications. So today what I want to do is have a dedicated discussion on what this might mean, because I think it's actually potentially very significant. But before going forward, let me take this moment to point out that I am now aiming for a new goal of 60,000 subscribers. So if you find yourself enjoying my content, your subscription would be appreciated. So we've been talking about this Ocarina of Time remake possibility for a long time. In the thick of the Switch generation, there were murmurings of an Ocarina of Time HD. Those amounted to nothing. However, as we've drawn ever closer to the Switch 2 generation, there was a growing consideration that maybe Nintendo would be saving a Zelda remake for the beginning of the Switch 2 generation, like Nintendo has done in the past, like with Wind Waker HD or Ocarina of Time 3D. Because Tears of the Kingdom came out in 2023, that game took pretty much the entire generation of Switch 1 to be made. So it's unrealistic to expect the next brand new mainline 3D Zelda to come out anytime soon for Switch 2, so Nintendo would likely need some sort of big major Zelda effort for the 3D Zelda fans early on for their new generation, as they typically do. So if they can't have a new game, what's the next best thing? A remake, especially when you consider that we are also approaching the 40th anniversary for Zelda. We also have the live-action Zelda movie, which is happening shortly after the 40th anniversary, interestingly, coming out March of 2027, and we have been seeing little signs leading up to this anniversary, such as the Lego set of the Deku Tree from both Breath of the Wild and, very curiously, Ocarina of Time. And what has made things even more interesting is that on two separate occasions, Eiji Aonuma, the producer of the Zelda series, seemingly has teased an Ocarina of Time project. And this notion becomes more believable when we consider that several times in the past, Aonuma has teased future Zelda games, and he's even confirmed it in the past as well, in the case of Link's Awakening Remake. But other Zelda games have been teased by him, such as Echoes of Wisdom, Majora's Mask 3D, Skyward Sword HD, but in the case of his Ocarina of Time remake, he paid special attention to the character of Rauru from Ocarina of Time when talking about Rauru's influence in Tears of the Kingdom from this Nintendo Dream magazine interview. And then there's also the Game Informer interview where flat out Aonuma was asked about an Ocarina of Time remake, a modern one, and he simply said no comment. However, he also laughed, and I have documented in the past that there is a correlation between him laughing and saying no comment in English when he normally speaks in Japanese, and this tying into some level of teasing of a future Zelda project. But most recently, friend of the channel, Attack the Backlog, put out a podcast or an interview, a very long interview with known popular leaker Nash Weedle, as I talked about earlier, has gotten a lot of things rightly when it comes to Switch 2, and he talked about Ocarina of Time Remake. He talked about how he heard about this a couple years ago, that they were starting to work on it. However, he also said, a year and a half ago, they were instructed to redesign the game's vision, and he also goes on to say, artistically, and he also says that he understands this is being made by Nintendo. And there's been a debate about this project, who would be working on it, Grezzo, someone else, Tantalus, and according to him, this would be Nintendo, and they are taking the time to redesign this game, at least from an artistic perspective, and this started apparently about a year and a half ago. The redesigning of this project. And this is what I find so interesting. So if Nintendo's working on it, what does that mean for the next mainline Zelda? Well, it reminds me of a situation a few years back, more than 10 years ago, back on Wii U, when we were talking about Zelda U, which we eventually came to know as Breath of the Wild, and also Wind Waker HD. As you see here from Aonuma, he said, Wind Waker is kind of a test pattern for the team. In converting Wind Waker, there's a lot to be learned. We can't change too much because in changing one thing, you can break something else, which is not something we want to do, but it's a shared team working on both of those projects, Wind Waker HD and the new Zelda for Wii U. Every day, they are learning something new. As we develop the controls for Wind Waker, they are learning how to apply those controls in the Wii U version. There's a feedback process where when something's discovered in development for Wind Waker, all that information is fed to the Wii U team. So we're working on those things, polishing as we go, and all of those things, it's a learning process. It's a test case almost, and we'll apply all those learnings that we've acquired in developing the Wii U game. And so, I'm starting to get the sense, assuming this rumor from Nashville is true, of course, take everything with a grain of salt, that what may be going on with this apparent Ocarina of Time remake is that it's taking on somewhat of a role to what Wind Waker HD was to Zelda U, or Breath of the Wild, in the sense that they are making this game, the Zelda team, internal Nintendo is working on both projects, and I'm sure there's assistance work coming up from different places like Monolith Soft, for example, and potentially more, but this is an internal Nintendo project, and they're building this remake and learning more about this more powerful, more capable console as they prepare and develop more of Zelda U, the next mainline Zelda. And according to Hidemaru Fujibayashi, back in 2023, even before talking about it with Aonuma, he already had some plans in mind for the next mainline Zelda. Now, does that mean Ocarina of Time remake? Does that mean the next just straight up new mainline Zelda that's not a remake, reimagining of anything? There's some room for interpretation there. But one of the main points Nashville is trying to make in this podcast with Attack to Backlog is that this project may take a while. He's not even sure it'll come out next year for the 40th anniversary, because he did hear about a visual redesign just about a year and a half ago. Now, this would be a remake, so I assume it wouldn't take as long as a full-on new mainline project. That's part of the idea of having a remake come out early on for the Switch 2, to get out a major Zelda effort that's exciting and brings in the fan base early on as we wait for the next big thing. That's one of the reasons why we would compare it to a Wind Waker HD. Now, maybe it takes a little bit longer than a Wind Waker HD, maybe it's a little bit more ambitious. And if so, it then reminds me of another scenario that happened a few years back, with The Legend of Zelda: Link Between Worlds. As we see written here from this Nintendo World Report, The Legend of Zelda: Link Between Worlds was originally meant to be a 3D remake of the Super Nintendo classic A Link to the Past. Aonuma told Wired in a recent interview that he didn't want to make a remake. After being given the task to create a 3D remake of A Link to the Past by Miyamoto, he wasn't sure how to incorporate this world into the new project. At the same time, one of his designers was working on this concept of having Link go into the walls, and after seeing that, the idea of making a new Zelda game with those mechanics clicked. So, what I find interesting here is that we're hearing about this Ocarina of Time remake project, and that a year and a half ago, there was a shift of some kind. And as I just relayed to you, more than 10 years ago, back in 2013, so at this point, almost 12 years ago, we had heard that there was a shift for A Link Between Worlds. It was initially going to be a remake, but it became its own thing. Is there a possibility here that they first started off Ocarina of Time remake as more of a straightforward visual remake, which would have looked visually impressive but essentially been the same type of game as the original Ocarina of Time, just with some quality of life updates? But maybe now, as things have gotten bigger and as they've gotten more acquainted with the Switch 2 and things have progressed, they've made a shift, and this game is taking on a bigger, larger role. If we're talking about this game not even coming out that early on for Switch 2, if Nashville is correct in his concern or skepticism of the game making out by even 2026, then at that point we're sort of losing the value of having a big epic remake early on in the Switch 2 generation. If we're talking about a 2027 release, or even potentially later, that's a little concerning to me. Because then how much longer do we have to wait for the next big brand new mainline Zelda game? Because if this is being made by also the Zelda team, I have to imagine that it's taking away at least some resources from the mainline project. Now, as I brought up earlier, there could be a lot of cross-development work, there could be multiple teams and studios involved here, all internal Nintendo. So it doesn't necessarily need to mean that this Zelda remake project will be taking away from the other. And similar to Wind Waker HD, in some ways it could be used as something that can improve the development process. But I also gotta think that if they are going bigger with something like this, it would also still technically mean that whatever that next big Zelda project is, the next brand new mainline one, it would still be a couple years after that point, right? Like if they're going for a bigger Ocarina of Time remake here, we're almost talking more so like a reimagining, then that's going to take on its own life, right? Similar to A Link Between Worlds, it essentially was the exclusive new 2D Zelda game, or 3D top-down Zelda game for 3DS. It was a bit of a hybrid, but it was like the new mainline Zelda for the 3DS, right? There was Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, but those were remasters, ambitious remasters for 3DS, but that's what they were. This Ocarina of Time remake project, if it is taking on more of a substantial role, somewhat similar to what happened with A Link Between Worlds, then it might just be the next big brand new Zelda game. Now, what I actually think is going on, and this is just my opinion, I don't think any of us really know fully what's going on beyond the actual team working on this project, but I gotta think that a big part of why they would want to visually redesign the game is because they're thinking about what is possible on the console, sure, but also their plan for how they want to market the Zelda series in the Switch 2 generation. With the live-action movie coming out in early 2027, with Zelda's 40th anniversary happening next year, it seems like this remake project would have to be involved in some way. And maybe it doesn't come out in 2026, but maybe they can at least tease us, show us a little glimpse of this project in 2026, and we see it maybe closer towards 2027 if this game is taking on a larger, more significant role. And if that happens, maybe about 2 years later, or let's say 2 to 3 years later, we see the next big brand new Zelda game. So this Ocarina of Time remake project takes on a bigger role, and it becomes something even more significant than your Wind Waker HD, and then we finally see the next big brand new Zelda in 2029 or 2030. Now when I think about that span of time, I do think it's not great. Because Tears of the Kingdom came out in 2023, and we had to wait a very long time for this game that was being built off of Breath of the Wild. Like, Breath of the Wild was that base. We thought a direct sequel would have led to a faster development time, and it ended up being about as long of a development time as Breath of the Wild. Now, I'm sure COVID played a role there, but it was still a lot longer than most were thinking. And so there's been this trend of mainline Zelda projects taking longer and longer, which is maybe one of the other reasons why they would want to do something like this Ocarina of Time remake, something substantial that can be kind of like a really good in-between game. But I also think it would be very unfortunate for us to have to wait until 2030 to get a proper Switch 2 Zelda game. That seems like such a dramatic long time, because that would be 5 years from now, and we're already 2 years removed from Tears of the Kingdom. But Zelda projects, the mainline ones, have been trending towards longer and longer development times. But at some point, something has got to give, right? They can't continue to lengthen these development cycles. It's just not going to be good for the business. Like, yeah, you can make amazing games, but if you have to wait 8 years between games, well then, I don't know, that's just not good for Zelda overall. Now, of course, you can have other Zelda projects in between, like 2D Zelda, that can help, but it can't just be 2D Zelda. But if they are going to do things like an ambitious Ocarina of Time remake that's almost functioned like more like a new game, then that might do the trick. And to be clear, I'm still not 100% on board with this idea that this Ocarina of Time remake is taking on a different level of significance here and it's becoming almost like a Link Between Worlds situation. But I am leaning in the direction of this being more than just a visual remake. There may be some interesting enhancements here, some interesting changes, and it could be something maybe more like what Capcom did with the Resident Evil 4 remake. Not quite so much how things went down with Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it's essentially a new game with a different storyline that has similarities. I think it would still be the same storyline, just with maybe some extra moments here and there. Might be more plausible if this project is taking on as significant of a role. Regardless of what is actually happening though, I do feel like we have to see something major Zelda relatively early on into the Switch 2's life cycle. At least show us something by the end of next year. Give us something to analyze and theorize about. Given how long Zelda development cycles have become, that's a big part of the Zelda fan process. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.